Hi, welcome back everyone to our last session of a very exciting conference. Nicole, we trust that you're going to keep us wide awake and fully entertained until the last. I've seen your talks before, so I'm sure you will. Take it away.
I will try. Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. It's so nice to see you again. Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you so much. So my name is Micol Bez. I am a PhD student at Northwestern University and at the Ecole of Normale. So I have the privilege of sometimes studying with Jose. So it's great to see you there. My talk is titled, With a Little Help from My Friends, Epistemic Loyalty and Indirect Testimonial Injustice in Testimonies of Sexual Violence. So yeah, I'll talk about this. So starting from the worry that testimonial injustice, a wrong done to somebody in their capacity as speakers caused by prejudice in the economy of credibility, can be and often is perpetrated directly and indirectly by the friends and loved ones of people accused of sexual violence. I will attempt to analyze some of the challenges of a problem that we often encounter these days, which is how to relate to a friend who has been accused of sexual violence. And for this talk, I'll limit to the first problem, which is what kind of doxastic attitude should we adopt, and what dangers of injustice are we running, right? The talk will focus on a particular instance of vicious epistemic partiality in friendship, namely what we will tentatively call epistemic loyalty, the widespread phenomenon of a prioristic belief in the innocence of our friends. We will particularly inquire into how such pathological attitudes come to bear in cases of allegations of sexual violence against our friends and loved ones, looking at some examples. The first part of the paper, The first part of the paper will attempt to define this epistemically vicious stance, distinguish it from other notions such as epistemic trust or non-vicious epistemic partiality. And the argument here will be that epistemic pushbacks and blind a prioristic faith in our friends' innocence are rooted in both epistemological and moral grounds. Knowers experience, on the one hand, a sense of certainty afforded by firsthand, albeit more or less anecdotal experience of their friend's behavior, and on the other, a sense of moral duty and emotional appropriateness. And then in dialogue with the literature on epistemic partiality in friendship, I will try to operate a distinction between vicious and virtuous partiality in friendship in order to claim that epistemic loyalty or these forms of epistemic loyalty are a form of bias that exceeds the boundaries of epistemic propriety and should be considered an epistemic vice. And specifically that in the second part of the paper, will argue that this attitude is epistemically and communicatively harmful, and in particular by expanding Jeremy Wanderer's relational development of Fricker, more this direct notion of testimonial injustice beyond the strict linguistic interaction between speaker and hearer, so an understanding of testimonial injustice that goes beyond the utterance. I will argue that epistemic loyalty can cause indirect testimonial injustice, and that in order to avoid committing such injustice, friends need to cultivate and robustly commit to an epistemically abstemious stance in such situations. And when a friend is accused of sexual misconduct, the epistemic attitude that is demanded of us as ethical agents is that of suspending judgment, an abstemious pluralism of sort that allows us to give our friends the benefit of the doubt without discounting the alleged victim's testimony or a priori believing its falsity. This sort of bracketing or radical impartiality is crucial, I think, especially if we take into account the structural tendency to discount the testimonies of victims of sexual violence, as well as the structural barriers to testimony on this subject, right? So yeah, these are the problems that I'm going to try to discuss, and it is very preliminary work, so I'm really looking forward to your notes and points of view. So let's consider an example. While organizing a conference on the work of one of their professors, a group of students is informed about some allegations of sexual misbehavior against that professor. What actually happens is that one of the students in the organizational committee receives the testimonies and informs the rest of the group. And I'm interested in the group dynamic. Then they meet to discuss whether they should continue with the conference or whether they should cancel it. After a first moment of shock, dominated by sheer understanding of the necessity to cancel, the various positions change and the group breaks neatly into two. On the one hand, two students argue that taking a neutral position on the matter without taking a stance on truth or falsity of the claims means canceling the conference and not intervening in public until the affair is resolved. We will call them the disloyal students. On the other hand, the two other students grow more and more uncomfortable with such an option, appealing to the now completely apparent to them falsity of the allegations and to moral arguments against such a betrayal. And it's important that here the notion of betrayal appears. Let us call them the loyal students. They appeal to their peers' sense of loyalty and friendship. He's been our supervisor for a long time, and most importantly, our friend. He never did anything like that with us. It would be unthinkable to jump to such conclusions. So here, and we will for today kind of just try to tackle one side of this problem. There are definitely two questions. One is, what is the doxastic attitude to take? And the other is, what are the consequences after such a, that would support such an attitude, right? Because whether appearing in public and canceling a conference is the necessary renegotiation of the commitments in friendship is a secondary question. But first of all, what pushes the students to say that it would be a betrayal to give any ground to the allegations, or that a good friendship or a good friend would assume that they're false? Similarly, when confronted about the allegations, the professor takes for granted that the students who know him could never contemplate the possible grounds of such claims, whilst allowing for the possibility that other people who do not know him and are not his friends, could doubt his innocence. This clearly puts the disloyal students at a disadvantage, as in order to avoid being gaslit into a position they do not want to take, they have to make the explicit remark that they do not pledge such a priori allegiances and desire to remain neutral. So neutrality here becomes somewhat of an active engagement, right? This inevitably creates tensions in the friendship. So putting aside the complicated erasure of power asymmetries that this discourse of friendship in academia entails, I'm interested in the fact that what allowed the loyal students to a priori categorize the testimonies as rumors and dismiss them completely is an interesting form of epistemic pushback, rooted in both epistemic and moral reasons, I think. In tracking privilege preserving epistemic pushback, Alison Bailey writes, I have seen white students who balk to Descartes' skepticism and have had a great deal of trouble understanding how and why anybody would doubt in that way, become perfect Cartesians when it comes to talking about race. We can speak in similar terms of the epistemic attitudes of the loyal students. They become perfect Cartesians, willing to doubt beyond reason, willing to venture into the most implausible hypotheticals before even evaluating the possibility of granting legitimacy to the allegations. They employ forms and levels of skepticism that they would never mobilize with regards to other testimonies in their everyday life, wondering whether the alleged victims are mentally unstable, part of a conspiracy, or interested in slander with no apparent motive. What is more, they discount the structural conditions of emergence of such testimonies, the barriers and disincentives to speaking up in academia. And this we've seen also, this is remarkable because these are topics that are talked about and they're not unaware of such barriers. This pushback is not necessarily or straightforwardly privilege preserving. On the one hand, by continuing their public association with the professor, the students are not necessarily defending their interest. On the other, the four women are in a good epistemic position to receive the testimonies of their peers. They are in the same position of asymmetry and experience similar forms of domination and vulnerability. It could have happened to any of us as one of the disloyal students. So while they might have interests to preserve in not speaking up, they're not blinded by the privilege and thus oblivious to the lived structural injustice of gender violence in academia. In this case, the testimonial injustice concerns more the epistemic excess authority and credibility than that privileged subjects enjoy, than the epistemic deficits that oppressed subjects have to endure. We will leave self-interest aside because in this example, the loyal students were the ones who had the least to lose in speaking up. Because they accepted the risk of being publicly associated with the accused, and most importantly, because they appeal to moral and epistemic arguments and not to institutional survival or necessity. So the mechanisms that justify the silencing and discrediting of testimonies are, I think, worth investigating on their own right. So in this example, and obviously there can be other things at play, but I think these are elements that are important. The loyal students are outraged. They blame the others of being bad friends to the professor, and they base their position on a set of a mix of commitments, right? On the one hand, moral commitments. It is difficult, actually morally unacceptable for the loyal students not to trust the professor, towards whom they feel a normative commitment. As Gloria Origgi argues, sometimes we trust others because we're morally committed to them, even if we do not have reasons to trust them. On a second level, there's an emotional reaction. Part of the student's rejection of the testimony is due to the emotional commitments and deep-seated feelings of affection, protectiveness, and fondness. But there's also an epistemological ground that's quite interesting, because in the argument, the loyal student's stance is further justified by an over-reliance on first-hand experience. The argument is built on the fact that they personally know the professor, and in their many interactions with him, he never behaved in such ways. Such an argument suddenly appears to them as rock solid, and they become irresponsive to the obvious objection that their positive personal experience of the professor do not mean that he could not have behaved in such ways with other students. So this is the puzzle that I'm interested in, and I'm not saying that this is the reaction that we homogeneously always have to such cases, but it is definitely one of the pathologies that keeps recurring and that creates a lot of damage. As Origgi argues, among the most common heuristics that make us commit some kind of epistemic injustice, there are bundles of inferences we make on the subject's reliability as a source of information. Fricker's central case of testimonial injustice, that is prejudice, falls into this category, but it does not exhaust it. What I want to assert here is that the case of testimonial injustice, in the injustice which we are considering, does not fall in Fricker's main case of prejudicial injustice. It is not rooted in prejudice, but I contend in loyalty. It's not just that we have a positive prejudice against for our professor, but it's also that we feel a commitment and a sense of sin in contravening it. The epistemic pushback operated by the loyal students is based on a complex bundle of moral and epistemic allegiances. It can be best described as epistemic loyalty, or at least this is the term that I'm proposing. While I recognize that my understanding of loyalty is closely related to Origgi's notion of epistemic trust, I want to propose that the phenomenon of the a prioristic certainty in the innocence of our friends is not reducible to epistemic trust, but characterized, one, by a different epistemic stance rooted in an over-reliance on first-hand experience and not on trust in testimonies, and two, by a different affective and moral attitude, which is specifically associated to friendship. Let us try to look at the epistemic aspect. The massive dependence we all have on testimonial communication has been an accepted truth of contemporary epistemology, or in any case, widely shared. Ruth Millikan, for example, argued that communication is a form of cognition by proxy, and that we are predisposed to accept communicated information as information from our own senses. In this context, Origgi develops the notion of epistemic trust, default trust, and vigilant trust, to account for the heuristic and legitimacy of our reliance on trust in other people's testimonies to ground our knowledge. Nevertheless, in our example, the conflict was not merely between two testimonies, or at least it's not framed that way, where the loyal students trusted one testimony and the disloyal students trusted a conflicting one. Most importantly, the conflict was not framed as a conflict between testimonies when it came to justifying the dismissal of the allegations of sexual violence. It's not a question of one word against another. It was an excessive priority granted to the first-hand experience of her testimony that served to justify this testimonial injustice. The epistemological driving force behind the claim of the loyal students was that the kind of first-hand experience that friendship provides has a higher epistemic value than a few testimonies, and that such a higher epistemic ground legitimizes a sort of epistemic loyalty to be required of friendship. This, in turn, opens the way to a different affective and moral attitude, distant from the notion of trust as a voluntary transfer of authority, right? There is something that is specific about this example. The moral and epistemic feeling that manifests is instead a sense of duty, of owing somebody your allegiances and commitment to the preservation of their interest and welfare. If I do not trust somebody, I do not necessarily feel guilty. Well, if I'm not loyal to a friend, guilt is an appropriate and often inescapable feeling. And while it would have been harder for the loyal students to blame the disloyal students based on their lack of trust of the professor, talking of loyalty allowed them to ascribe blame and shame, this shame associated to a major failure in their role as friends. Our example can thus be better understood and described under the label of epistemic loyalty, understood as an effective epistemic posture overly determined by one's commitments of loyalty to a friend, which manifests in an overinflation of the epistemic value of personal first-hand experience, and in a sense of moral duty to critically and a prioristically believe in a friend's innocence and infallible moral character. This is not always the attitude that we have, but we've seen this particularly emerge in cases of testimonies of sexual violence, and my point is with particular effects of injustice. What I will try to qualify now is what I will try to do is now to qualify this concept as a vicious form of epistemic partiality. As Simon Keller argues, loyalty is not an intrinsically evaluative concept. Without some substantive argument, there is no guarantee that if something counts as a loyalty, then it counts as something good or something that merits our approval or encouragement. I propose to classify this kind of epistemic loyalty as an epistemic vice, a character trait, attitude, or thinking style that systematically obstructs the gaining, keeping, or sharing of knowledge, getting in the way of knowledge, and perpetrating epistemic injustice. In a context already fraught with excessive scrutiny and overly doubtful attitude towards testimonies, with a specific asymmetric power positions of the complainant, as well as the general epistemic terrain of patriarchy and rape culture, hinder the possibility of speaking up against sexual violence and of being heard, epistemic loyalty can function as a final nail in the coffin of testimonial injustice. As Jeremy Wanderer defines it, a testimony is an internally diverse pattern of norm-governed interactions that includes the speech act of telling someone something close to its explanatory core. But the important part is that a diverse pattern of norm-governed interactions, right? Such interactions involve several socially situated actors, amongst which the bearers of the testimony, the hearers, the addressees of the accusation, and a number of institutions and a network of other social actors that relate in epistemically relevant ways to these three. So there are several actors that participate in direct and indirect ways to the activity of the testimony, to receiving it, to discounting it, to giving it uptake. I think that friends are relevant actors in this supporting network, that they can have an important role in the testimonial process and even commit forms of testimonial injustice. Indeed, my worry is that friends and loved ones often do participate in various forms of direct and indirect testimonial injustice, silencing and gaslighting of victims, specifically because of their relationship of friendship to the accused. In particular, friends risk committing forms of indirect testimonial injustice, understood as testimonial harm that does not derive from a direct linguistic interaction between speaker and hearer, but from the more indirect participation of various actors in the economy of credibility. This is a further elaboration of Fricker's more immediate account of testimonial injustice, which seems to involve the direct linguistic interaction between speaker and hearer, or at least takes that as a central case, with one explicitly rejecting the testimony proffered by the other. Wanderer proposes a departure from Fricker's notion of targeting, which limits the audience to whom the act of testimony is addressed to those acquaintances intended by the speaker. We agree with him that the scope of those addressed by the testimony exceeds beyond the strict interlinguistic act of testimony and beyond the audience targeted by the speaker. Following this intuition, I propose that his extended audience, and in our case, the friends of the accused, can have an indirect effect on the testimony and even cause forms of testimonial injustice without directly participating in the interlinguistic interaction of the testimony per se. When a testimony of sexual abuse is brought against a friend, we as friends do not necessarily have access to the testimony. And in many cases, we're legally prevented from such access. This, nevertheless, does not resolve our involvement or arguably our potential responsibility in giving indirect uptake to the testimony. The way in which we keep relating to our friend can cause testimonial harm by constituting an indirect reception of the testimony, as well as by contributing to discredit or silence it, or by increasing the structural barriers to the emergence of other testimonies. If all the friends of the accused believe him or her a priori, if they ignore the matter, if they build walls of silence and keep supporting the accused and giving them epistemic and symbolic power, the victims find themselves isolated, ignored, and de facto silenced. Indeed, in many cases, when evaluating to testify, victims are intimidated by the friends of the perpetrator as much as by the perpetrator themselves. As Camille Kouchner explains in the 2021 novel that awoke France to the question of sexual abuse within the family, friends are often immediately considered as the extended audience of the testimony. And I quote, I had to try to counterbalance the allegiances of my father-in-law and my mother, those great law professors. We had to be prepared to counter the potential rebuttals of their friends, some of them great lawyers who were brought in to defend their own silences. Even if we are aware of the pervasiveness and structural nature of such dangerous forms of protectionism and cronyism, it is difficult to avoid epistemic partiality towards our friends. As Sarah Stroud remarked in her seminal 2006 paper, as a matter of general tendency, we do react differently to reports when these concern our friends. I agree with some of Stroud's critics who argue against the idea that this doxastic observation entails the stronger claim that in order to be good friends, we ought to acquire beliefs that fail to satisfy ordinary epistemic standards. Indeed, the extra scrutiny that we reserve to claims about and accusations against our friends can and should operate within the bounds of responsible epistemic practices. While some slight bias in belief formation might be permitted by friends, any such bias should and would fall within the bounds of epistemic propriety. This is also Jean-Nicod argument. The bias that exceeds such boundaries, on the other hand, should be considered pathological. Let us consider one of Stroud's examples and compare to our own case, to our own damning story, so to speak. She focuses a lot of attention in the following case. Suppose, again, that someone tells a damning story about a friend of yours. Your friend appears in a bad light in this tale. He is portrayed as having acted badly, even disreputably. Suppose, for instance, that a third party reports that your friend Sam recently slept with someone and then never returned any of that person's call, knowingly breaking that person's heart. Well, our case is definitely more serious than this. In the following passage, right after, Stroud argues that, for a good friend of Sam, you ought to react differently to this information than you would otherwise, scrutinizing and questioning the damning evidence with particular insistence. She would not argue that you need to ignore the damning story, believe in Sam's innocence a priori, or without the possibility of scrutinizing the evidence. Nevertheless, it is relevant that our case then does not lend itself to the operation that Stroud suggests. Say that we were told that Sam was accused of sexual violence. Say, as it is often the case, that we do not have access to all of the information about the case, not even to the direct testimony, and that procuring such information would be impractical, damaging, or re-traumatizing for the victim, or simply beyond our means. We're not the right venue for such an investigation, and we are aware that we could not be impartial in such a pursuit because we have an asymmetrical access to information, and possibly that we are not legally allowed such privileged information. In such a case, the extra scrutiny that Stroud mentions would not be possible. Furthermore, in such a situation, we would know that strong structural conditions of silencing testimonies of sexual violence are in place, and that the speaker who reports the crime is likely to be in a position of epistemic marginalization. In such a situation, we would be aware of the dangers of epistemic partiality and of applying extra scrutiny and questioning to this particular kind of damning story. The situation would demand that we apply, I think that the situation would demand that we apply precautionary principle and cultivate an epistemically abstemious stance, committed to suspending judgment about our friend's innocence, given that we do not nor can have access to the necessary elements to lean one way or the other. We cannot presume their innocence nor their culpability, and we need to relate to them coherently. If we are to remain our friends. We cannot a prioristically presume our friend's innocence because such a presumption would cause the silencing and discounting of the testimony, unless that is such a presumption were fully non-committal, a belief without any purchase of pragmatic consequence, which would not be stated out loud or influence our behavior. But such completely intimate beliefs are rare, and if they exist at all. Sorry, I had a little technical problem. Okay, what we observe over and over again is instead friends publicly defending their loved ones against accusations of sexual misconduct about which they have no substantial or at the very least impartial information, causing severe testimonial harm to the alleged victims who are discredited, silenced, and discouraged from seeking justice. I can mention two recent examples. The famous case of Professor Avital Runnel, who was accused of sexual misconduct in 2018, and a letter defending her character and arguing that the allegations against her did not constitute actual evidence was signed by a large number of powerful academics and influential friends. Interestingly, the letter was followed by Judith Butler's revision and apology for signing it. Similarly, in April 2021, Beppe Grillo was a major Italian politician, made the regretful political and moral faux pas, posting a very angry video to deny the allegations of rape against his son, causing an outrage in the Italian media. In both cases, such interventions damaged the victims and their credibility, silencing their testimony and increasing the structural barriers against the further pursuit of justice. Obviously, these are cases where this became extremely public, but even in less mediatized situations, the risk is absolutely there. So this preliminary analysis raises more questions than it answers. The main one being how to sustain an abstemious stance in substantial ways and not just nominally, whilst continuing the relationship with our friends. Indeed, if Stroud showed us something, it is that we tend to be biased towards our friends in a sense. As contemporary psychologists argue, people think that we would protect their friends, people think that they would protect their friends far more than they should. So Stroud's observation about inclination towards epistemic partiality in friendship is relevant in that it exposes a structural danger, a default attitude that requires our continued attention, epistemic vigilance. If we take this problem seriously, we have to pay careful attention to the forms of indirect testimonial injustice that are continued friendly relating and the communicative commitments attached to such relating can cause. Our implication as friends is not limited to the adoption of a correct, abstemious epistemic attitude. A continued friendship required a set of communicative commitments, which in turn can expose us to the danger of compromising our commitment to testimonial injustice. And there's a few problems that come out of this, and a few that I'm still working on. But let's look at one example, just to leave you by sharing some of the ongoing open question of this work. The primary question that arises is that of continuing to talk to our friend and whether we can continue to talk to our friend about the case. When we talk to our friends, we invest in the communication, at least at a minimum level, and we are prepared to adopt their point of view as true, possibly changing our mind in light of what we hear, or to justify why we will not and why the other should alter their views instead. If we are not willing to engage at this basic level, communication becomes either impossible or void, reduced to a mere act of formal listening that does not involve any uptake. This is not by far what we mean by the communicative demands of friendship. Normally, right? On the contrary, a friendship normally involves a thick stance of trust, which requires recognition of distinctive features of the personality of the one trusted in a way that creates and maintains rivalries and that can elicit a sense of betrayal when broken. Now, are there a minimal or thick stance of trust compatible with an abstemious epistemic position? That's the problem that I'm kind of raising here. Arguably, whilst we maintain some recognition of the feature of the personality of our friend, receiving the accusation is not demolishing all that we know about our friend. What we must give up in order to take an abstemious stance on the accusation is the basic communicative trust that for what concerns stricto sensu the accusation. We have to give up the idea that the friend will give us the relevant information, as structurally that's not possible, as well as our willingness to adopt their point of view as true, possibly changing our mind in light of what we hear from them about this matter. Arguably, any form of uptake or willingness to change one's mind based on what we hear from our friend would compromise our abstemious position and risk causing indirect testimonial injustice, given the circumstances of such listening, right? So in order to avoid such a risk and to maintain continued relationship, I think the communicative demands of friendship need to be renegotiated. And an abstemious position would, on this account, result in the erosion of the basic trust that one requires to talk to our friend about the accusation, but only about the accusation, while the minimal level of trust for other communications would perdure, and arguably even a thick stance of trust in some important respect. This I don't think is an implausible scene, but maybe you'll tell me what you think. I don't think it's such an implausible scene. After all, imagine I tell my friend, dear Sam because of the example in Stroud, dear Sam, in order to fulfill my epistemic responsibility to be abstemious about a specific topic, the accusation of sexual violence, I cannot trust you enough to talk about it. Not in a way that would allow for any substantial uptake or for the possibility of changing my mind in light of what I hear from you on this matter. I cannot because of the situation, not because of some substantial alteration of my beliefs about your character. Indeed, allowing for such a possibility, given the structural conditions of testimony of sexual violence and my asymmetric access to information, would constitute an act of testimonial injustice. This account, if it works, and if it could ever work relationally, that's a big question, based on the notion of minimal trust, would allow for the continuation of the friendship and even for a thick notion of trust in friendship, while requiring that we rescind our communicative commitments in very specific and circumscribed manners. It would also require that for the continuation of the friendship, Sam accepts to withdraw the communicative demands in similar and specifically circumscribed ways, so that our notion of friendship allows for such renegotiations. Now, I mean, this is a proposal that concerns the question of how to discuss the topic itself. But for example, in our initial example, or just as well as in the letter in the letter in support of Abigail Ronald and in response by Judy Butler, we see that other questions arise, and specifically ones that don't directly have to do with talking about the issue, but of talking about our friend, or for example, giving them important support in ways that are indirect. So for example, in the letter to in defense of Abigail Ronald, there's a lot of insistence in her quality as a philosopher. And that has the indirect effect of silencing possible victims. Or in this example that we had in the beginning, there's a question of still organizing the conference with the professor, which is not talking about the topic, but it does have a role. So all of these developments are really still open for discussion. And I'm aware that I'm just targeting a first step in this question. Right.